Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Tank Talk podcast. As you can see, unfortunately, I am here all by myself. John is sick today, but he will be back next week. Want to thank you for being part of the number one podcast on the face of the earth. And today we've got a very special guest, and that is Stephan Tanner. He is the owner of Amazonas Magazine. He's done so much over the course of his career in fish keeping, and I really wanted to bring him in because I think it's going to be awesome to have him here. We could talk about what it takes to run a world-class magazine, his favorite fish, interesting things that have happened in the hobby, both in the past and where he sees things going in the future. It's going to be really awesome. Welcome to the podcast. Introduce yourself, what it is you do with your life, and thank you for being here.
Hey, Jason. I'm Stephan Tanner. I'm the publisher of Amazonas and Coral magazines, among a few other things I do. I also run a small specialty company called Swiss Tropicals that mostly does filters and a few additional items, mostly specialty stuff for breeders or people that tend to have more than one fish tank. Also, I probably have a lot of customers that have just one. But yeah, I don't know. I've kept fish for the better part of 45 years now.
That is awesome.
And
How did you get involved? And I think we met a long time ago. It was probably a booth where you were doing some stuff with Swiss Tropicals, and I'm sure Amazonas as well. How did you get involved with Amazonas Magazine?
oh, the original publisher of Amazonas magazine is Natur- und Tierverlag in Germany, meaning nature and animal publishing. And the original German editor of Amazonas is my good friend Hans Georg Evers. He's well known as a catfish expert worldwide. And I've known Hans since, I think, 91 or 92 when we first met. Actually, by an editor, which was Rainer Stawikowski, the former editor of Dots magazine. And together with a bunch of other friends, we then run the BSSW report, which is the German Catfish, Barb, Loach, and Tetra Association from 94 to 2006, when I was the editor, and he was one of my four people on the editorial board. And so in the early 2000s, he became the editor-in-chief of the German Amazonas magazine. And then in 2012, when James Lawrence, the late James Lawrence, um, published the English version of Amazonas, or started the publishing, he contacted me on behest of Hans to do translations. So I took over translating for Coral magazine and Amazonas magazine. And that's how James and I got into contact. And so I did that for, I don't know, 5, 6 years. And then, yeah, it was in 2018, I believe, if I recall it correctly. I was just stepping 27, or maybe it was 2017, I forgot exactly, but I was literally just coming back from a trip to Interzoo, stepping off the plane when my phone pings once it had service again, and got a text message from James that he um, will close Amazonas magazine if I have no interest continuing. His health was declining at that point, and his doctor pretty much told him, "You need to step back. Too much stress." And yeah, brilliant as I was, I decided it's a good idea to buy a paper publication. And yeah, a few years back, we then took over Coral magazine, and I can say, yeah, I worked for the better part of 7 years, and I've never made a cent.
So, what would you say when it comes to Amazonas? how would you describe the publication? What is your primary goal when you release this? It's a quarterly magazine, right? And it's absolutely outstanding. So, what are you trying to accomplish with this?
Essentially, we publish once a month. One is Coral, and then the next month is Amazonas. But the goal is essentially to produce a magazine that kind of pushes the envelope. So while we try to make it very accessible, so the idea is that you don't need a science degree to read it, because you would lose too many people. And if you need a lexicon, or you need like 3 screens with Google or Chat GPT or whatever else you use as an information source, in order to read something, it becomes very um, tedious, I would say, and people don't like that. So, but on the other hand, we also want to make sure that what other people have published, because that is unfortunately, as you and I talked before, sometimes, especially if it's something extremely rare, you go and look what is known about it, and you look at different sources, and you find out that they pretty much all say the same thing. They may not always cite the source, which is another sort of, by training, I'm a molecular geneticist. And so, rule number one is you always have to be able to support what you're saying. And so, you should have the proper references in there. If you take wisdom from somebody else, you should credit them properly, because that's the way science publishing works. And I'm lucky in that regard that several of the people in my team, like Courtney Tober, who is our editor in chief, she is a trained scientist in her own right. So she knows the drill. Then Ann Whitman, who was the interim chief and is now a senior advisor, she has over 50 years of editorial experience. I mean, she is a powerhouse. She has been, publishing when people still put letters together to print. Um, so her experience is awesome. But the overall goal of the team is to essentially publish a magazine that is covering various topics and also covering timely topics. Now, for obvious reasons, with a 2 month cycle, is we're not like a newspaper who, in the middle of the night shifts the headlines. Also, we have done that. Uh, One time, I almost lost Courtney in the process when we decided to run the Weird Waters issue with that comic strip thing. And 3 weeks before we went to press, I called her and said, "We scrapped the existing topic and bring this in." And that caused a whole bunch of upheaval. But I thought the idea of bringing kids into the hobby was worth it, and that's still one of the things where we're talking a lot, and we have a big project about doing a beginners publication. I mean, not periodicals, just a special issue, essentially putting together the combined wisdom, if you want to call it that, of a lot of our authors, including the editorial team, to get a publication out there that essentially, if you buy a ready to go aquarium kit, with lights and heaters and whatnot, that together with that magazine, you can go home and start and have a 95% chance of succeeding. Because one of the things the industry has been a bit lacking is not explaining to people that fish keeping is not an off-the-shelf hobby. It's not, a remote controlled car where the only thing you need to do is pop a bunch of batteries in it, switch a button and you're good to go. I mean, obviously, you might still run into a wall with it, but you're damaging a toy. Here we're talking about live animals, and without, sounding weird, yeah, we should keep in mind all the time that if we make mistakes, animals are going to pay the price for it.
And that's a good point. What does it take? I see these articles in your publications, and they are top notch. I mean, the level of detail, the attention to detail. What does it take
Thank
for
you.
somebody to actually publish an article? Like, what are you looking for when you're like, okay, I'm going to run, this is our bi-monthly issue, here's the articles that we select? What is the process where you're making those selections?
Start with, since we are a licensed edition of the German version, we look at what the Germans have published and select articles from there. Now, the German publication is um, a number of pages smaller, so we do have to create our own content. And one of the things is, of course, reaching out to authors we know. I know a lot of people worldwide, and we ask them, you know, would you be able to write about this and that? Then we, of course, get a lot of unsolicited um, articles, and sometimes, I find something on Facebook. Some young person has some really cool observation or something, and I just contact them. Or a scientist publishes something that is of interest to the wider hobby audience, and we contact the people and say, and sometimes people come back and say, well, I have no experience in writing and I don't know if I can do that. And we say, well, we'll help you make it look good, because sometimes people, you know, are sort of intimidated by that. And it's not, none of us is a rocket scientist. We're scientists, but not rocket scientists. And the idea that, oh, you need, 50 years of experience in order to write an article is not true. And sometimes when questions arise when an article is worked on and none of us knows the answer, we usually know somebody to ask and say, hey, this is written here, what do you have to say about this? And do what an editorial process should do, which is verify that pretty much every sentence is correct, not just in terms of English and grammar, but also in terms of content. And obviously, you know that better than anybody else. The the amount of information out there today has never been greater. I mean, every single minute we're talking here, the amount of information in the internet grows. The question is, and that's the toughest question, is what of that information is actually correct? And I think, especially for beginning hobbyists, the biggest drawback of the internet is to decide who publishes trustworthy information. Now, I'm not saying we never make mistakes, because only people who never work never make mistakes. But the issue is, if you don't know, don't just, you know, copycat it. Ask somebody who actually knows. So that's what the editorial process is all about. Now, we have the benefit, we have essentially roughly 2 months to verify and ask questions and go back and forth with the author to produce a good article. And, if you ever want to interview Courtney, she would absolutely confirm that the amount of work they put into it is extraordinary. It's all about trying to publish the most trustworthy, the most reliable information that's out there, because that's the only thing we have in competition with the internet. I mean, if we just nilly willy publish stuff, then eventually we'd lose the slight edge that we still have over internet sources. Not saying that all internet sources are bad. There's some that are very, very good. But it's hard for people who are not in the field to figure out which sources are good and which are maybe a little less reliable.
So you brought up some interesting points. One of the things, obviously, is the content, the written content. But then we had spoken before about one of the things that Amazonas does so well is not only the written content, but the pictures are National Geographic level pictures. How did, in your experience, how does yourself, authors, how do they get pictures that are just absolutely world class? Like, what is going into that in this day and age?
Well, luckily, as we talked before a few days ago, the digital camera technology has, of course, made that a lot easier. It's not that you spend hundreds of dollars going through rolls of film to figure out that, oh, this trick isn't working. But it starts off with a decent camera. And now, let's face it, today even some cell phone cameras are already. I mean, I'm always astonished how good cell phone cameras are. But in order to get a really good shot with a depth of field where, for example, the whole fish is sharp, so you see the barbels, you see the scales, you see the eye, and so on. That requires a little bit of experience. You need to know how to work with f-stop. You need, how open the camera is, how much exposure you have, to use flash or no flash. Now, most really experienced fish photographers use photo tanks, which is pretty much a tank which is fully set up, and then sometimes there's a glass pane in the middle. So all the decoration, or most of the decoration, is behind that, and the fish sits in front. And so there's maybe a couple of inches of space that the fish can't really go anywhere. And you take a picture that way. I have my good friend Ingo Seidel in Germany, world famous catfish author and close friend of both Hans and I. Um, I've sat with him through several photo sessions, taking a picture of a single like 5-inch pleco, and it takes him literally like 20 minutes to position the animal properly with like chopsticks, trying to move him so that you know it, the head is towards the front, it goes a little bit diagonal so that you get a really nice shot. So there's a lot of effort into doing that, and of course, uh, that's not always possible. I mean, we have published articles by breeders who bred something extraordinary, and the shot is just, you know, a cell phone shot because that's the only thing that you have as documentary value. And so, in such a case, we're willing to, accept the photo for documentary purposes, not necessarily because it's artistic the most impressive one. But I remember back in the 80s, there were lots and lots of you know people talking about, oh, clown loaches are breeding, and but yeah, my camera just broke, and every single time I heard that, I was like, oh, I mean, if somebody comes today and says, oh, I bred this and I have absolutely no photo documentary evidence whatsoever, I just like, oh yeah, whatever. So
So, and
it's
that brings up an important point. You know, you're talking about these pictures that people have and all this content. And you and I discussed a while back this concept of artificial intelligence and what that's doing to information, what's that doing to the publishing industry. We face it on the YouTube side. I am sure you are facing it as well on the publishing side. How is that changing what you do as Amazonas Magazine and what you're looking for in terms of content and what you can actually rely upon?
well, we have had a fair share of I call them wizards, who try to sell us content that is literally ChatGPT or some other AI platform generated articles. And we did that in Coral Magazine, published an article that was completely concocted by Matt Peterson with AI, including the images, including the couple that supposedly described that marine angelfish. And we published it as if it's, something, a new species description that is going to be published. And then Matt wrote a background story to it and said, this is all literally made up. Now, we had people, after it went out, within hours of being out there, emailing me. One guy was really upset about that. We preempted the scientific name by publishing it before the formal uh, taxonomic description was released. And I had to tell him, well, maybe go read that background piece before you get all upset. But it showed like how easy it is to dupe people uh, into that. And case in point is that we made a freshwater version and we sent that to Ann Whitman and Courtney and others without really telling them. And Anne came back with a whole series of comments where we had to tell her this is all made up. She didn't catch it. And I'm not saying, Anne is a super experienced person, has a big fish room, has been keeping and breeding fish for decades. She's not a bloody beginner, neither on the editorial side nor on the hobby side. And she fell for it. And she was actually mad that she went through an article that we concocted to see what's possible. And so that led to a discussion in the editorial board. How do we address this? And I said, our really only way is going to look for the credentials of the author. And we have had several articles in the last year that came when you went dig for the author. Either the author didn't exist, like we had somebody claiming to be a postdoctoral fellow at some institution. Somewhere, I'm not naming names, it's not necessary, but I'm like, the institution lists every researcher and he was nowhere to be found. So yeah, we verify uh, that through checking if the person exists. Now, obviously, we can't verify the existence of every single human being. Um, if that were so easy, then it wouldn't be difficult, but it's not. But yeah, usually if something comes out of the blue, we ask for background, we ask for experience. And a lot of the AI generated stuff is maybe less of a trying to cheat part. It's more of a, I just want to sell content. And we get lots of those sort of 0815 writers. They say, oh, I can write about everything. And my first question is always, what first-hand experience do you have? Because, I mean, if you never kept the fish, how could you possibly write about fish that is in any way, can you, collect together Wikipedia and FishBase and all the other info sources? Sure. But how is that in any way, I mean, usable? Do we
Yeah,
all need our sources to like beef up an article? Sometimes maybe put a box with explaining some part of it where the information comes originally from Wikipedia or other all sources. Of course, everybody uses pre-existing information to base the message on. But if it's literally just rummaging it together, and that's where AI is very, very efficient because you can just say, write me a 1,000 word abstract about, I don't know, pork chop rasboras, and you're gonna get something which is sort of vanilla 0815. There's no specific information. It's all sort of, but then you get the weirdest stuff. You ask AI to do it, and it's like, yeah, it swims through the reefs. And I'm like, pork chop rasboras and reefs? Probably not. So
Yeah, it's it's a challenging thing. So that struck a thought in my head because you've been associated, like you said, with Amazonas for quite some time. What would you say in the time that you have been associated with Amazonas are maybe the top two or three discoveries where you were like, wow, this is, you get really excited about it? So just a couple things that really stood out to you over the years.
I'm not sure it goes back just to Amazonas itself, but it's probably certain breeding behaviors that were unknown before. And I think it was published in one of the original old German things, which is the banjo catfish, those big ones, which are actually carrying around the eggs, which is at that point was a you know totally unknown thing because people always thought, well, they just scatter the eggs somewhere and then swim away. And it turned out, no, some species actually literally carrying around on their bellies. And so that's a cool thing. Then mouth brooding behavior in certain catfish, also something that we now know is prevalent, or not prevalent, but occurs in several species in Africa. And again, something that has totally evolved independently of say, cichlids, where that brooding behavior is known both in South America and in Africa. So it's always interesting to see how nature over millions of years has figured out strategies to optimize the survival of offspring, and very often it was probably challenges in the habitat that led to that. And personally, as a scientist, I'm always amazed by the plasticity, because in some cases, some species are larvophil, or larvae loving, to translate it into English. Mouth brooders, meaning they wait until they hatch and then pick up the larvae. Others pick them right up when they get laid. And there's everything in between. And some species do both. That depending on what's around them, they pick up the eggs right away, and some wait until they hatch. And so it's probably because in their habitat, sometimes it's better to do one versus the other. And then there's cool intermediates where they put the eggs on leaves and then drag the leaves around. So at that point, instead of a stone that's immobile, they just make it into a mobile home and just take off with the leaf if there's a problem. And that's pretty, I mean, these are the kind of cool things that you observe. And if you can set up a fish tank and you have a species like that at home, and you observe that behavior where they carry around a leaf with eggs on it, that's just so cool. I mean, that's what makes you sit in front of the tank and grab a beer, a coffee, or whatnot, and just enjoy the show, literally.
So, in your time of fish keeping, and especially in the last 20 years, I know I've been keeping fish since the 70s, you've been keeping fish forever. What trends in fish keeping have you seen that have come and gone, and or maybe some trends that some things that used to be popular in fish keeping they're no longer around? Is there anything that you've seen that's kind of surprised you over time, like, wow, I can't believe fish keeping has moved in this direction, either away from a certain technology or towards something that you think is just, it was unexpected?
Well, one thing that when I got into the hobby in the early 80s, I was, I was mid 70 or probably even early 70s, African cichlids became sort of the absolute wave, especially in Europe, because flights of wild fish from Malawi and Tanganyika and Lake Victoria to Europe were fairly quick, and a huge number of species were, pretty much every week you found something new. There was no internet then, so there was 6 or 7 European or German publication, I should say, and I have most of them down in the basement. And I mean, they were just chock full of new stuff, and that has gone probably till the early 90s, and then that wave was sort of replaced by the pleco wave out of Brazil. And interesting enough, both of these waves have sort of a little bit subsided. The cichlids are still around, but much less now. Maybe also because imports from Africa have become more sporadic. They're, they cost a lot more. There's very few collectors left, and and a lot of species were here for a while, or forms were here for a while and disappeared, because it's always the same sort of cycle. Something new comes in, it has a high market value, and then everybody jumps on the ship of breeding, and then they literally flood the market. And once that's happening, the price implodes. And 3 years later, you have a hard time finding anybody keeping the species, which is always a little bit discouraging, because I keep a few species that have been breeding for 6, 7 generations, simply because they became difficult to get. And one good example is two spotted barbs from Sri Lanka, which the last legal exports were probably in the mid 2000s. And then Sri Lanka pretty much said no native fish can be exported. Now they produce bucket loads of guppies and swordtails and other stuff for the trade. There's lots of breeders there, but they don't export native fishes until a few, like maybe last year or so. I heard one of my German colleagues, wholesaler, got some wild two-spotted barbs in for the first time in close to 20 years. But I've had that fish ever since. I've brought fish back to Europe. I've bred them by the hundreds. But it's always interesting whenever I breed a batch, people are like, oh, this exists. It's a very cool fish. Oddly enough, nobody commercially produces that fish or has ever done that, despite the fact it's very easy to breed. But the catfish wave, of course, was essentially broken by the Brazilian government coming up with a very restrictive whitelist, which put pretty much all their fish collectors out of business. And now that a few years back they revised that and went back from the whitelist to a blacklist, because they had 700 some species on the whitelist, which is very difficult to enforce, because everybody at the border that controls that needs to know those 700 species, which even for experts is not always so easy. And they essentially saw the writing on the wall that this isn't working. It destroyed the trade, and it doesn't really do what it's supposed to, which is prevent the overharvesting, because zebra plecos and a bunch of others high value things, they were smuggled and stolen by the thousands out of the habitat, and still are, unfortunately. That's despite the fact, like, zebra pleco is site is protected now, so you can trade it if you breed it, but Brazil is not releasing any wild caught, despite the fact they get harvested illegally.
And that brings up an interesting point. And I've talked about this before on my channel a couple of times. I've talked with some importers where that's their entire business is importing, in some cases, wild caught fish. From your perspective, as both a scientist and a hobbyist, how would you, what are your thoughts, what are your opinions on wild caught fish in general, especially over the tank raised ones?
Right. Well, there is no one size fits all. First of all, obviously, one needs to sort of divide it up into what's commercially like of interest, meaning it makes money. What is from a practical point of view makes sense, and what is doable in terms of technology. Not all wild collecting is bad. I would have to state that clearly, because in many areas of the world there is little to no reasonable income. If you're on a remote island in the Pacific or up in the jungle of Peru, you have relatively limited income opportunities. And say if you're somewhere in the Amazon, you can cut down the forest and plant coffee or cacao or palm oil or whatever. It always goes in concert with devastating the forest. Now, there are ways of, say, for example, planting coffee or cacao in the forest, like it's done in Africa in certain areas. It's all doable when it's managed well. The problem is the global market wants coffee and cacao and other things as cheap as possible, and that goes essentially hand in hand with our own agriculture, meaning making a large field of corn and or wheat or soybeans is more cost effective than planting individual plants all over the place. But the ultimate thing is, certain areas of the planet, you just cannot do intensive agriculture because the soil is very thin. If you take the trees that hold everything together away, it takes a flood or two, a rain or two, and there's nothing left. That little amount of soil is gone, washed away, and the only way you can keep doing is you cut down the next piece of forest, which we know from many places on the planet. You just cannot do that forever. You could just literally gonna run out of forest to cut down. Aside of all the climate impact, just literally there is no more forest to kill. So in that regard, selling aquarium fish, collecting and selling aquarium fish becomes a sustainable resource. First of all, in most of those areas, it's not that you can go in and catch every single fish. Very often, when they're collecting, is actually towards the middle to the end of dry season, when those fish collect in little puddles in the forest. And a few weeks after, that puddle has dried up and all the fish in it died, or the only thing that's left is like a wolffish and an electric eel or something that has eaten pretty much everything else. But those fish, cardinal tetras, raminoses, corridoras in certain types, they spawn in huge numbers, and their reproductive potential far outstrips the available resource, meaning they have way more offspring than will ever make it. So you can harvest cardinal tetras out of the forest pretty much all the time. I mean, not it's seasonally dependent, but without impacting the overall population. And we have seen that in the Rio Negro, the original source area for cardinals, until probably 15 years ago or so, pretty much, or 20 years ago now. Pretty much all cardinals came from the Rio Negro area around Barcelos in Brazil, but they're still there. They have been harvested by the millions, and it doesn't have any serious impact on the populations. Now, today they're also professionally produced. In Indonesia are large breeders, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Germany, the Czech Republic, and of course they're now also collecting cardinals in Colombia. And so there are certain fish where it actually does make sense to collect wild because the market demand is too small to warrant commercial breeding. It's just the numbers you can sell every year are too limited, and they're only seasonally available, and they fetch a decent market price, so they're worthwhile for the collectors to collect. And it keeps them from doing other things, cutting down the forest, or the worst thing is gold washing. And we saw that in Brazil with the whitelist, where a huge amount of collectors simply had to look for other income sources. They still have kids to feed. And like everybody else, the first thing is there is no hungry conservationist. It just doesn't exist. So if they have no other income, they will do whatever it takes to survive. And giving them the chance to use the forest and the water that's there in a sustainable way is actually protecting the forest, protecting the animals, protecting the livelihood of people, mostly native. I mean, these are not white dudes like you and me going collecting. These are mostly native South Americans or native Indonesians or wherever you are. Those are people from the community that do the collecting. So this does support essentially low income people with a good renewable income.
Yeah, 100% agree. And there are some fish you cannot you can't breed in captivity as well. And if you can manage those sustainably, I'm all for it. Which brings me to an interesting question. Obviously, again, you published all these incredible articles, and the fish there are sometimes fish I've never even heard of. Right now, if you were to basically pick, okay, I know you've got a fish room just like I do. If you were to pick your top five fish that you absolutely love, if you could only keep five fish, what would they be and why? You can only keep five. There's no, you got five.
Man, I don't know where to start. Well, it almost certainly would have to be some of the actual Corridora species, the what is now today uh, known as Corridoras. There's several in that group that I absolutely love. Um, then I'm a big fan of barbs, and I right now have a little Petya species called Setnai, Setnai, and yeah, it's on my to-do list in terms of breeding. It's a fish that is only very sporadically imported, but super pretty. And no, I don't have a no, I don't have the cover here with where it's on. We had it on the barb issue cover, and so that would be a barb. Then I'm a big fan of those little Nemachailin loaches, river loaches. There's some absolutely cool species, and I have I don't know, probably 6 or 7 species down in the fish room right now, and yeah, there I probably couldn't even settle on. They're like cories in Southeast Asia. They occupy pretty much the same niche, and there's probably hundreds of species. And they're breedable too. It's a cool fish, mostly doesn't outgrow 2 inches, so it can be kept in a 20-gallon tank. I mean, you get a better behavior. I see you have a 50-gallon flat or a low boy behind you. that's absolutely the perfect tank to put a group of a dozen to 20 in there, because they're bickering, and they have personalities. I mean, they're literally like staring at each other, and they often swim not unlike our darter uh, um, perches swim around here in our rivers. So those are cool. Talking about native fishes, darters are absolute. And when I was still in Columbus, I kept for 5 or 6 years a group of Tippecanoe darters, and I kind of never managed to breed them, but I've heard of people having been successful. And some of those darters out of the central part of the US, meaning they don't really need to get super cold in the winter to thrive. They don't need to go through excessive changes. And they are not, you know, under high heat. They're a really cool native fish to keep. Now, some are protected, so it's always good to check with your state what you can legally keep or not. I simply always say, guys, let's not keep stuff that's illegal, regardless if it makes sense or not. There's two different questions. What is the law sensible or not? But the law is still the law. And the dumbest thing we can do for the hobby is keep fish that are illegal, because that gives ammunition to people who think it would be great if we could keep no animals. And I'm obviously very much against that. So let's not do stupid stuff that harms the hobby as a whole. But so we had loaches, we had tetras or barbs. Yeah,
Now,
tetras are the other sort of.
I got to ask you though, because you said Cory cats. That's a massive group. Do you have one or two of your favorite Corys? Because we've kept like 20 different species in our fish room, and there's some really nice ones out there.
Yeah, I would say of the. I think the Corridoras group is of the Corridoras senso stricto, the actual Corridoras. Geoffroy is a dream species I've never kept. It's actually the type species of the genus Corridoras. But one of the is now known as Brochis robine, the flagtail Cory. That is one of my favorites.
So
Then we,
here's the next question I have for you. And by the way, those are great picks. We recently had the Pantanlensis in the fish room, which wow, that was a great fish. Very unique Cory in the way that they swim, and they were swimming more open water than any Cory I've had in a while. They love to sit on rocks. Cool fish. But now here's a great question, and I think people are going to really love this because you have so much background. You see the stuff pouring into Amazonas, and in some ways, you're not only seeing the trends, but you're setting the trends that, hey, when people see fish in your magazine, like, I want these. So if you were to pick in the next, let's say 3 to 5 years, I don't know, 3 or 5 fish that you think either are going to make a comeback or they're not on anybody's radar right now, but you see them becoming much more popular. If you had 3 to 5 fish to pick, what do you think is going to be out there?
I think what really um, currently runs the show are a lot of the small tetras that come out, and some of them have now been bred commercially. I mean, they came in mostly from the Brazilian Shield, so it's essentially southern part of, not the very south of Brazil. It's sort of where Paraguay and Bolivia border Brazil, a little bit north of that. And the numbers there are not huge in many cases. I mean, my good friend Flavio Lima in Brazil, one of the geologists who describes a lot of those species, says we're actually surprised that they're still making it, because there's pretty much, I mean, it looks like the Midwest, soybean fields and other stuff. I mean, you can even go on Google Map and just go down Street View and follow a street, and you could be in somewhere in Arkansas. I mean, it just looks exactly the same. And in those little creeks that drain from that area there's tons of different species, and a lot of these little tetras in the Hyphesobricon group, uh, they are very popular. They're very often very easy to breed because they all breed more or less the same way. And so, and they go in small tanks. And given the fact that increasingly the population worldwide, not just in the US, but Europe, Asia, and so on, lives in smaller apartments or smaller houses simply because the way we live in the Midwest with large, 3 to 5,000 square foot houses is not the norm. The vast majority of people live in smaller dwellings, and so smaller tanks become more the norm. And then you combine that with the scaping wave, aquascaping, then yes, these little tetras are by far the ones where I think where the market turns, because you're still looking at a fish, even tank raised ones out of China or Indonesia and so on. You're still looking at a retail of $10 to $15 a fish. So they're for the retailer, they're still not a bread and butter cheap fish. They're uh, um, they're making a good margin. They're relatively easy to keep. They live 5 6 years without any big issue. They don't eat plants. They don't dig. All these things make those fish, I would say, certainly uh, important. Then, of course, all the the man-made type stuff, endlers and relatives, absolutely a big winner. I mean, the sheer number of forms that pop up that are bred as strains now is humongous. And so these fish are by far the ones that will keep the hobby probably going because they attract a lot of people to the hobby.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that too, because right now in the fish room, we import thousands of fish every 4 to 6 weeks. And right now, we've got the red cherry tetra, which is the Physobricon Emzul. We have the Kogel tetra, the red tail penguin, and it's just, they're not cheap. You're absolutely right. They are, right now, as we're speaking, they're pretty darn expensive. And if you want to get a striking group of them where you want 15, 20, 25, you're going to spend some money, but they're
Yeah.
amazing fish. The other one too, and I'd love to get your feedback on it, are the bitterlings, which are really starting to get in the hobby. Volcano bitterling, the whitefin, and that's one where you got to be a little cautious because unlike the tetras, where they're easy to keep and like you said, possibly easy to breed, these bitterlings, they're a different story. I don't know how much experience you have with them. I know I'm pretty certain they showed up in an Amazonas issue in the last year or
Yeah,
two, but oh my gosh, those fish are different.
absolutely. And I mean, for those of listeners who may not know bitterlings, they have a really unique breeding approach. They put their eggs into mussels, and then the larvae escape from there once they hatch. So the mussels are essentially a host, and the mussel doesn't get harmed in the process. So it's not parasitism in the way that it would harm the host. But there have been efforts breeding them in professional setups, and I know that some people have had success. I have never kept bitterlings. Now, I used to work for a pet store in late 80s, early 90s in Switzerland, and we had bitterlings on and off, and these were usually the European ones because the Asian ones weren't uh, essentially known at that point. But they were usually sold as pond fish to put outside, and I mean they're cool. And now some of those Asian ones, mostly from the Korean Peninsula, from Japan, but also from China, I think there's probably a lot more species than we're currently aware of. And I mean, the colors, the breeding behavior. it's certainly a really cool thing. The problem of breeding, I mean, you can argue on one hand it protects actually the wild collectors a bit, because something that cannot be easily bred essentially means that every year you can sell some, because it's not that you sell 50 and then somewhere a commercial breeder produces them and then you're out of business. So there's a bit of job security involved when things are more difficult to reproduce. But there comes a little bit the issue with importing these types of fish, because they are from moderate water conditions. They could be released and would actually make it. Would they breed necessarily? That's always a different thing. Establishing something is more difficult than people think, but there's a certain risk. The problem is also because they come from similar um, water conditions as a lot of our native fishes. If they carry parasites, then those parasites might potentially pose a risk for local fish fauna. So there's always the same sort of thing. Do not release anything. It doesn't matter what it is. Even if it's a wild animal that you collected somewhere, just don't ever put it back. I mean, if you keep, say, I don't know, red belly dace or something, which is an awesome aquarium fish actually, and they're all over the place in the Midwest, and but if you collect them and keep them in the aquarium, and then I don't know, a year later you want to change out the tank, please don't go back and dump them, even where you found them, because you kept them in the aquarium. They may have been exposed to something that they have not seen outside. You bring them back, you might just transfer something that they may have gotten in your fish room back into nature, which is a no-go. So there's that risk, and I know in Europe, the European Union has pretty strict rules when it comes to certain carp type fishes, exactly because of the pathogen risk and the potential invasive risk. So again, smart to check first what's legal, and then just for Christ's sake, use common sense.
Yeah. You brought up a great point. It's something that I've mentioned before on my channel, and that is, if you do have fish in your aquarium, you you put them in nature. Even if they don't survive, you throw them in a lake, a pond behind your house, and they bring in a pathogen because you got some fish from a pet store, who got them from a wholesaler, who got them from Indonesia or Vietnam or Singapore. And there
Yep.
are some internal parasites growing in these fish that can, the fish will often look okay. Most fish are going to be colonized with something. It could even be part of their normal flora. And that winds up in a pond, a lake, or a river, and these fish are not used to it. You can have a heck of a problem.
Right. I mean, you even see that. I mean, you bring in fish too, and you know, having worked with wholesalers and in a pet store and transporting fish from Europe here in the past when I was still in Columbus, I had a fish and wildlife license. So I brought lots of rare species from Europe that were either produced there or their importers brought them in, and here nobody carried them. So I brought some over. And sometimes you put two fish together, especially when they're freshly transported, so they're stressed out and so on, and it just blows up. It just so there's always a uh, good idea is to keep those fish in quarantine, and quarantine means on their own. I mean, yes, certain things you can combine with little to no risk, but even if you have an established community tank, 125 in your living room that looks cool with everything, even if you have a reliable dealer you get your fish from, set up a 10-gallon tank next to it. I mean, it costs, all included, maybe $100. Sounds like a lot, and I know $100 is not nothing for a lot of us. But if you just dump them in your tank and something goes wrong, first of all, the damage is likely to exceed what the quarantine tank would have cost. But then you know you have to deal with the fact that if you have kids, your kids are sad because there's a bunch of dead fish. Your wife is upset because maybe it stinks. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why that quarantine thing is a good idea. So it's yeah, comes from my own experience, and yeah.
Sometimes, I mean, we all learn it eventually. I don't. I know we are about that hour, and that's. I don't want to infringe on your time. You got things to do, but before we
So I
wrap
got
this,
another half hour. I mean, and
yeah.
you can cut it together.
But what I wanted to mention is before we wrap this up, I'm going to put the Amazonas link down in the description again for people who are interested in a world class magazine. It's something that we have that we read bi-monthly. It comes in. It's awesome. So definitely check out that description for that link. Anything else you want to say, mention before we wrap it up for the day?
Well, I mean, for those who know the magazine, I don't need to tell you spending $39 a year on the magazine is fairly small compared to what most people spend on their fish tank in a year. So for those who have never had it, I mean, get a subscription. The truth is very simple: is we can only survive with subscribers and advertisers. And I mean, unfortunately, some people come to me as like, oh, you just cut this and cut that back. And I was like, well, I cannot cut my designers. I cannot cut my editors. I mean, it's a certain amount of work that needs to be done. Also, I cannot go to the printers and be say, I'm going to pay you half for the print. I mean, paper costs have gone up, and so I always say, if you want to read good content, and if you think you like our magazine, I almost sound like an NPR person, begging for donations. Well, we don't want a donation. What we want is a subscriber, somebody who values it, should for good quality media. Uh, it there is a price, and it's relatively modest in my opinion. And so I can only beg people to say, if you like to read about cool fish, plants, and other critters, hey, please subscribe, because it's really helping us. It helps me pay our authors, photographers, the team who puts the stuff together. Because even if I'm the figurehead of the company, I'm literally just the person in the background. The other 9 people of the team are the ones who do the heavy lifting. I'm the kind of person who tries to keep everything together.
Well, I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate your time. We'll have to have you come back on for a part two because there's like a million things we could talk about when it comes to
Yeah.
the fish and everything like that, and the background and wild caught versus tank raised and all that kind of stuff. But again, thank you for being here. And again, everybody, check out that link. I promise you, it is one of the highest quality magazines on earth in any niche in any topic whatsoever. So, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate the time, and keep the good work up.
Thank you.